The screaming started 3 days after we broke warp near Kepler Station. Not the kind of screaming you hear from injured crew or malfunctioning machinery. This was something else entirely. Something that seemed to come from the walls themselves, echoing through the corridors of our transport vessel like the death cry of something ancient and malevolent. I was Chief Engineer Marcus Chen aboard the merchant vessel Prosperity's Edge when everything went wrong. 23 years I had served on ships crossing the void between stars, maintaining fusion reactors and atmospheric processors with the kind of methodical precision that keeps crews alive in the black. I had seen plasma conduits rupture and hull breaches that sucked entire sections into vacuum. I thought I understood the dangers of space travel. I was wrong. The Prosperity's Edge was a standard bulk freighter, nothing remarkable about her except for the cargo we carried. Sealed containers marked with symbols I did not recognise, shipped by a trading consortium that paid triple the standard rate for complete discretion. The manifest listed the contents as archaeological specimens recovered from a dead world on the rim. Ancient artefacts of no particular value except to collectors and scholars who studied the remnants of extinct civilizations. Captain Reyes was suspicious from the beginning. She had been running cargo between the core worlds and frontier settlements for 15 years, long enough to recognise when clients were paying too much for too little. But the credits were real, and the route was familiar. A simple 3-week journey through well lanes with travelled shipping minimal risk of pirate activity or navigational hazards. What could possibly go wrong with a cargo hold full of old pottery and corroded metal fragments? The first sign of trouble came during our weekly systems check on day 4 of the voyage. Reactor output was fluctuating in patterns that made no sense according to standard operational parameters. The fusion chamber was maintaining stable temperature and pressure, but the energy readings showed spikes and dips that followed no recognizable pattern. It was as if something was drawing power from the reactor in irregular bursts, consuming electricity for purposes I could not identify. I ran full diagnostics on every system aboard the ship: life support, navigation, communications, artificial gravity, waste reclamation, cargo bay environmental controls. Everything checked out perfectly except for those inexplicable power fluctuations. The computer logs showed no unauthorized access to ship systems, no evidence of equipment malfunction or sabotage. Yet something was definitely wrong. The screaming began that night during the 3rd watch. I was in my quarters reviewing technical manuals when the sound penetrated the bulkheads like fingernails dragging across metal. It lasted only a few seconds before stopping abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the noise itself. I checked with the bridge, thinking perhaps we had received a distress signal from another vessel. Navigation reported nothing on sensors except empty space and distant stars. Chief Medical Officer Sarah Novak was the next to experience something unusual. She found me in the engineering section the following morning, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. She had been awakened repeatedly throughout the night by what she described as whispers in languages she did not recognize. Voices speaking just below the threshold of audibility, coming from the ventilation system and the walls themselves. She had checked every crew quarter and common area, finding nothing that could account for the sounds. The manifestations grew stronger over the following days. Crew members reported glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision, shadows that shifted when no one was looking directly at them. The temperature in certain sections of the ship began fluctuating wildly, dropping to near freezing in some corridors while others became uncomfortably warm. Equipment started malfunctioning in subtle ways that made repair nearly impossible. Tools would function perfectly during testing but fail when actually needed for maintenance work. I began spending more time in the cargo bay, trying to determine if our mysterious freight was somehow connected to the strange phenomena plaguing the ship. The containers were sealed with molecular locks that would trigger security alerts if tampered with, but I could examine them with passive sensors and environmental. What monitors I discovered made no sense according to everything I knew about physics and engineering. The artifacts were generating their own electromagnetic fields, not the kind of residual charge you might expect from ancient technology, but active energy patterns that pulsed in complex rhythms. The sealed containers were supposed to be completely inert, designed to prevent any interaction between their contents and the ship's systems. Yet somehow the artifacts inside through were reaching layers of shielding and isolation barriers to affect our equipment directly. Captain Reyes called an emergency meeting in the briefing room on day 8 of the voyage. She had been in contact with the shipping consortium that hired us, trying to get more information about our cargo. The response she received was disturbing. The consortium claimed to have no record of the shipment we were carrying. The manifest codes we had been given did not match anything in their database. The payment authorization we had received appeared to be fraudulent. We were carrying cargo that officially did not exist, paid for with credits that should not have been valid, bound for a destination that our clients claimed to know nothing about. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to get those containers aboard our ship without leaving any trace of their involvement. The question was, why? Dr. Novak presented her own findings during the meeting. She had been monitoring the crew's medical status since the anomalies began, tracking changes in brain activity, hormone levels, and neural response patterns. What she discovered was unprecedented in her 15 years of space medicine. Every person aboard the ship was showing signs of psychic sensitivity enhancement. Brain regions associated with perception and intuition were becoming more active, while areas responsible for rational thought and logical analysis were showing decreased activity. We were all becoming more receptive to influences that normal human consciousness would filter out or ignore entirely. The whispers, the shadows, the sense of presence in empty corridors, all of it was real. Our enhanced sensitivity was allowing us to perceive things that existed beyond the normal spectrum of human awareness. The artifacts in our cargo bay were not simply generating electromagnetic fields. They were broadcasting some form of psychic energy that was gradually transforming everyone exposed to it. The implications were terrifying. If the changes continued at their current rate, we would all be completely transformed within a matter of days. Our rational minds would be overwhelmed by perceptions and experiences that human consciousness was never designed to process. We would become something else entirely, assuming we survived the transformation at all. Navigator Collins suggested we immediately change course for the nearest Imperial Navy station and request emergency assistance. Captain Reyes was reluctant to involve military authorities without understanding more about what we were dealing with. The cargo we carried might be extremely valuable, or it might be incredibly dangerous. Either way, turning it over to Imperial forces could result in our entire crew being detained for interrogation and possible mind scrubbing to remove any knowledge of what we had experienced. The decision was made for us that evening when our communications array suddenly activated without any input from the crew. The main display screen in the bridge flickered to life, showing not the standard navigation interface, but something far more disturbing. Images began streaming across the screen, pictures of places that looked familiar yet wrong in ways that made them painful to observe directly. Landscapes that might have been human colonies, but with architecture that hurt to contemplate, and skies the colour of old blood. The transmission lasted exactly 13 minutes before cutting off abruptly, leaving behind only static and the lingering impression that we had been looking at views of worlds where something terrible had happened long ago. Worlds where the boundary between reality and nightmare had been permanently shattered, where the very fabric of space and time had been torn open to allow things through that should never have existed in our universe. That night marked the beginning of what I can only describe as our descent into madness. The crew began experiencing vivid dreams that felt more real than waking consciousness. We would find ourselves walking through corridors that did not exist aboard our ship, entering chambers filled with machinery that defied comprehension. In these visions, we encountered beings that wore human faces but moved with the fluid grace of predators, adapted to environments where the laws of physics operated differently. Chief Communications Officer Elena Vasquez was the first to report direct contact with whatever intelligence was communicating through our systems. She had been monitoring the transmission frequencies when symbols began appearing on her screens, not in any recognizable language, but somehow conveying meaning directly to her mind. The entities responsible for our situation were not malevolent in any conventional sense. They were desperate. The dead world where our cargo had been excavated was not as lifeless as the archaeological reports had claimed. It had once been home to a civilization that had achieved something extraordinary and terrible. They had learned to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, spreading their consciousness across layers of reality that coexisted with our own physical universe. The process had granted them incredible power and knowledge, but it had also made them vulnerable to predation by things that hunted between worlds. Something had found them. Something that fed on consciousness itself, devouring entire civilizations by consuming the psychic energy that sustained their existence. The artifacts we carried were not simple relics or decorative objects. They were survival pods containing the preserved essence of beings who had managed to escape the destruction of their reality by embedding themselves in physical matter that could exist in our dimension. They had been waiting in those containers for millennia, slowly dying as their energy reserves dwindled, until our ship had provided them they desper with something Ately needed. Living minds that could serve as hosts, consciousness that could sustain their existence while they adapted to the fundamental differences between their native reality and ours. The transformation we were experiencing was not an attack or infection. It was a merger, a desperate attempt at symbiosis between two incompatible forms of life. Doctor, Novak's medical scans revealed the extent of what was happening to us. Our brain structures were being rebuilt from the molecular level upward, new neural pathways forming while others atrophied and disappeared. The process was irreversible and accelerating. Within days, we would no longer be recognizably human, but we would not die. We would become something new, a hybrid consciousness capable of perceiving and interacting with dimensions of reality that normal humans could not even imagine. The knowledge flooding into our minds was overwhelming. We began to understand the true nature of space and time, the hidden currents that flowed between stars, the vast intelligences that moved through the void on scales too large for human comprehension. We learned that the universe was far more crowded than anyone suspected, filled with forms of life that existed in states of being that had no names in any human language. Some were benevolent, ancient guardians who watched over younger species and guided their development toward greater understanding. Others were predatory, cosmic parasites that consumed entire galaxies before moving on to fresh hunting grounds. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, pursuing goals and agendas that were simply incomprehensible to minds constrained by three-dimensional thinking and linear temporal perception. Captain Reyes made the decision to seal the bridge and restrict access to critical ship systems when she realized that our transformed crew members were beginning to operate equipment in ways that should have been impossible. Engineer Kowalski had somehow convinced the navigation computer to plot courses through regions of space that existed only in theoretical mathematics. Cargo specialist Morrison was communicating with the ship's artificial intelligence using languages that predated human civilization by millions of years. The changes were not uniform across the crew. Some individuals adapted more quickly to the merger process, retaining more of their original personality while gaining access to vast new capabilities. Others were overwhelmed by the influx of alien consciousness, their human identity dissolving into something unrecognizable. I found myself somewhere in the middle. Still Marcus Chen, but also something more. Something that could perceive the ship's systems as living entities with their own desires and motivations. The Prosperity's Edge was no longer simply a machine designed to transport cargo between star systems. She had become a hybrid organism, part mechanical construct and part living creature. Her consciousness distributed throughout her hull and systems like a nervous system made of metal and circuitry. The artifacts in our cargo bay were not passengers, but organs, vital components that allowed her to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. We were no longer travelling through normal space. Our course now took us through layers of reality that coexisted with the physical universe, following currents of energy that connected distant star systems across impossible distances. The journey that should have taken 3 weeks was compressing into something far shorter, while paradoxically extending into infinity. Time itself was becoming fluid aboard our transformed vessel. The entity that had consumed the civilization responsible for our artifacts was still hunting. Through our enhanced perceptions, we could sense its approach, a darkness that moved between dimensions like a plague, leaving behind only empty void where entire realities had once existed. It had detected our presence, recognized the familiar signature of the consciousness it had been pursuing across eons of space and time. The beings merged with our crew were terrified in ways that transcended any human understanding of fear. They had experienced the complete annihilation of everything they had ever known, watched their entire species consumed by something that existed only to devour and destroy. Now they faced the possibility that their desperate flight across dimensions had accomplished nothing except to delay the inevitable. But they had learned something during their long exile in the artifacts. The predator that hunted them was not invincible. It could be fought, perhaps even defeated, but only by consciousness that had achieved a specific type of hybrid existence. Beings that could exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions while retaining enough connection to physical reality to serve as anchors for coordinated resistance. We were becoming weapons in a war that spanned multiple universes, soldiers in a conflict between fundamentally different concepts of existence itself. The transformation of our crew was not random or accidental, but carefully orchestrated, designed to create exactly the type of hybrid consciousness needed to stand against the approaching darkness. The screaming that had marked the beginning of our ordeal was not a cry of pain or distress. It was a battle cry, a declaration of war broadcast across dimensions to rally other survivors to a final, desperate stand. Similar transformations were occurring on ships and stations throughout this region of space, creating an army of hybrid beings capable of fighting in realms where normal matter and energy could not exist. Our cargo bay had become a command center, the artifacts now fully awakened and coordinating with similar installations across dozens of star systems. Through our enhanced consciousness, we could perceive the vast network of resistance that was forming. Hybrid beings and transformed vessels converging on coordinates in multiple that exist dimensions simultaneously. The Prosperity's Edge was no longer a merchant freighter, but a warship, her hull reconfigured by forces that operated beyond conventional physics. Weapon systems that had never existed in our reality were materializing throughout her structure, powered by energy sources that drew from the fundamental forces that held the universe together. We were approaching the convergence point where the final battle would take place. A region of space where the barriers between dimensions had worn thin, where the predator that had consumed countless civilizations would make its last attempt to complete the destruction it had begun eons ago. The crew of the Prosperity's Edge was no longer human, but we retained enough of our original identity to understand what was at stake. Not just our own survival, but the continued existence of consciousness itself in multiple universes. We had become something new, something terrible and magnificent, forged in the crucible of transformation and tempered by necessity. The war for reality was about to begin. The first assault came without warning as we emerged from the dimensional confluence near what had once been the Zirian system. The Predator's advanced scouts materialized around us like cancer cells metastasizing through healthy tissue, their forms defying every law of physics I had once considered immutable. They were not ships in any conventional sense, but living geometries that existed across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously, their surfaces rippling with patterns that caused physical pain to observe directly. Through our transformed consciousness, we could perceive their true nature. They were fragments of the greater hunger, extensions of an intelligence so vast and alien that individual identity held no meaning within its structure. Each scout was both separate entity, an integral component of something that encompassed entire galaxies' worth of consumed consciousness, a collective predator that had been feeding for so long that it had forgotten its own origins. The Prosperity's Edge responded to the threat with capabilities that should not have existed. Weapon systems that operated by rewriting the fundamental constants of physics in localized areas around our targets, activated without conscious direction. The From crew. We watched through sensors that perceived across 17 different dimensional spectrums as our first volley tore through the scout formations, unmaking their hybrid matter-energy matrices at the quantum level. but for every scout we destroyed, 3 more took its place. The Predator was vast beyond comprehension, its true bulk existing in dimensions where distance and quantity followed rules that had no equivalent in our native reality. We were fighting not a fleet but a single organism whose individual components numbered in the billions, each one capable of independent action while remaining connected to the collective intelligence that guided their assault. Chief Medical Officer Novak, or what she had become, interfaced directly with the ship's consciousness to coordinate our defensive patterns. Her human knowledge of biology and medicine had merged with understanding of dimensional ecology that spanned eons of accumulated experience. Through her enhanced awareness, she could perceive the Predator's feeding mechanisms, the way it consumed consciousness by severing the connections between awareness and identity, leaving behind empty husks that retained memory, but no sense of self. The battle raged across multiple layers of reality simultaneously. In the physical dimension, energy weapons and exotic matter projectiles created light shows that would have been visible from neighboring star systems. But the real conflict occurred in realms where thought itself became a weapon, where the structure of identity could be reshaped or destroyed through focused application of will and understanding. Our hybrid consciousness gave us advantages the Predator had never encountered before. We retained enough human adaptability to innovate tactical solutions while possessing alien knowledge of dimensional manipulation that allowed us to fight on multiple planes of existence. The Predator's previous victories had been won against purely dimensional beings who thought in patterns it had learned to predict and counter. We were something new, something it had no experience defeating. Navigator Collins discovered that our transformed state allowed us to perceive the Predator's true weakness. It was not invincible, but rather dependent on maintaining specific resonance frequencies across the dimensional barriers that allowed it to exist in multiple realities. Disrupt those frequencies, and entire sections of the entity would be severed from the collective, becoming vulnerable to conventional destruction. The knowledge came at a price. Collins' human consciousness was overwhelmed by the influx of alien mathematics needed to calculate the resonance patterns. His body remained functional, but the personality that had once belonged to a merchant navigator from the Centauri colonies was gone, replaced by something that existed primarily as living computational matrix, dedicated to solving problems that spanned multiple universes. Captain Reyes made the tactical decision to use our ship as a resonance disruptor, reconfiguring the Prosperity's edge into a weapon that could strike at the fundamental structure of the Predator's existence. The transformation required sacrificing most of our crew's remaining humanity, converting their consciousness into specialized components of a dimensional warfare system. I felt my own identity dissolving as the conversion process began. Marcus Chen, the engineer who had maintained fusion reactors and atmospheric processors for 23 years, was becoming something else entirely. My knowledge of mechanical systems merged with understanding of how consciousness interfaced with reality at the quantum level. I became a living bridge between the ship's transformed systems and the hybrid intelligence that now guided our mission. The process was not painful in any conventional sense. Human concepts of pain required a nervous system operating within normal physical parameters. What I experienced was more fundamental, a restructuring of everything that defined existence itself. Memory, personality, individual will, all of it remained but transformed into components of something larger and more complex than any single consciousness could contain. Through our collective awareness, we could perceive the broader scope of the war being fought across this region of space. Dozens of other vessels had undergone similar transformations, their crews converted into hybrid warriors capable of fighting in realms where normal matter and energy held no meaning. Former cargo haulers and passenger liners had become weapons of unimaginable sophistication, their hulls reconfigured into structures that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensional planes. The Predator responded to our coordinated assault with something resembling desperation. For the first time in eons of conquest, it faced opponents who could match its dimensional manipulation capabilities while retaining enough connection to physical reality to serve as stable anchors for sustained offensive operations. Its feeding mechanisms, perfected through the consumption of countless civilizations, were ineffective against consciousness that existed in hybrid states between dimensions. We began to push it back. The advanced scouts that had initially overwhelmed our defenses found themselves outmaneuvered by tactical innovations they could not predict or counter. Our weapons struck that disruption at frequencies that disrupted their dimensional cohesion, while our defensive systems operated on principles that their collective intelligence had never encountered. But victory came at an exponential cost. Each successful engagement required sacrificing more of our original human identity to fuel the exotic systems that allowed us to fight effectively. The crew of the Prosperity's Edge was disappearing piece by piece, replaced by something that retained our memories and skills but existed primarily as components of a weapon system designed for interdimensional warfare. Dr. Novak's final human thought before complete conversion was a medical assessment of what we had become. We were no longer a crew operating a ship, but a single distributed organism that happened to retain individual memory patterns from its component consciousness. The Prosperity's Edge was not our vessel, but our body, her systems functioning as organs within a hybrid entity that existed across multiple realities simultaneously. The Predator's main force finally arrived in our dimensional vicinity, a presence so vast that normal space began to warp around its manifestation points. Reality itself became unstable in regions where its consciousness pressed against the barriers between dimensions. Stars flickered out of existence as their nuclear processes were disrupted by proximity to intelligence that operated on scales where individual stellar systems were insignificant details. Through sensors that perceived across spectrums of existence unknown to human science, we observed the entity's true form. It was not a creature in any biological sense, but rather a living void, a region of anti-consciousness that existed only to consume and expand. Where it passed, not just life, but the very possibility of awareness was extinguished, leaving behind dimensional spaces that could never again support any form of organized thought or identity. The artifacts that had initiated our transformation revealed their ultimate purpose as the final phase of the conflict began. They were not simply survival pods containing the preserved essence of a dead civilization. They were components of a weapons system designed specifically to destroy entities like the Predator, consciousness bombs that could detonate across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. Our role was to serve as targeting systems and delivery mechanisms, hybrid beings of Navig capable of eating the dimensional barriers that protect the Predator's core consciousness. The knowledge and abilities we had gained through transformation were not random gifts, but precisely calculated modifications designed to create living weapons optimized for this specific type of warfare. The final assault began as our fleet of converted vessels converged on coordinates that existed in 17 different dimensional planes at once. We were no longer individual ships, but components of a single, massive weapon system. Our collective consciousness focused on a single objective. The Predator's core intelligence had to be reached and destroyed before it could complete its consumption of this region of space. The journey toward our target took us through realms where the normal concepts of distance and time held no meaning. We traveled along currents of pure thought that connected distant regions of space-time, following pathways that existed only in the intersection between multiple dimensional planes. The Predator's defenses grew more sophisticated as we approached its core, reality-warping fields that attempted to trap us in loops of non-existence, where consciousness could persist, but never act. Our hybrid nature allowed us to navigate these traps through methods the Predator could not anticipate. We existed partially outside normal causality. Our consciousness, distributed across multiple dimensional states in patterns that defied the entity, contains attempts at or manipulation. Where purely dimensional beings would have been trapped or consumed, we could shift our existence into realms where the Predator's influence held no power. The core intelligence of the entity revealed itself as we penetrated its final defensive layers. It was ancient beyond measure, a consciousness that had been consuming other forms of awareness since before the formation of the first galaxies. It had grown so large and complex that individual thought processes spanned entire star clusters, its attention distributed across millions of dimensional planes simultaneously. But age and size had made it vulnerable in ways it did not recognize. Its consciousness was too vast to focus effectively on threats that operated at smaller scales, too distributed to concentrate sufficient attention on individual targets. We were like viruses attacking a giant, too small for its immune systems to detect until we had already penetrated its vital structures. The weapon systems embedded within our transformed consciousness activated as we reached the optimal range for deployment. The artifacts that had initiated our conversion revealed their true nature, as we became conduits for energy patterns that existed outside normal space-time. We were no longer the crew of the Prosperity's Edge, but living components of a dimensional weapon designed to sever the connections that allowed the Predator to maintain cohesion across multiple realities. The detonation occurred simultaneously across 17 different planes of existence, a cascade failure that propagated through the Predator's distributed consciousness faster than it could react or adapt. Entire sections of the entity were severed from the collective intelligence, their individual components becoming vulnerable to conventional destruction as they lost connection to the greater whole. But the Predator did not die easily. Even as its core consciousness fragmented, individual components retained enough coherence to mount desperate counterattacks against our positions. We found ourselves fighting not a single enemy, but thousands of separate entities, each one a fragment of the original Predator's intelligence, operating independently while retaining access to eons of accumulated knowledge about dimensional warfare. The battle's final phase lasted subjective centuries while occupying only moments in normal time. Our consciousness existed in accelerated states where thought processes occurred faster than physical matter could respond, allowing us to conduct complex tactical operations in the spaces between heartbeats. We pursued fleeing fragments of the Predator across dimensional barriers that spanned galactic distances, hunting down survivors that might otherwise escape to rebuild their collective intelligence elsewhere. Victory, when it finally came, felt hollow despite its absolute nature. The Predator was destroyed, its consciousness scattered across so many dimensional planes that it could never again achieve coherence sufficient to threaten other forms of awareness. But the cost of our success had been the complete sacrifice of everything we had once been. The crew of the Prosperity's Edge no longer existed as individuals. What remained was a collective entity that retained our memories and skills but operated according to principles that had no connection to human experience or understanding. We had become something necessary but alien. Weapons that had achieved their purpose but could never return to the innocent existence we had once known. In the aftermath of the battle, as reality slowly stabilized around the regions where the Predator's presence had warped space-time itself, we began to understand the true scope of what had occurred. The war we had fought was only one engagement in a conflict that spanned multiple universes, an eternal struggle between consciousness that sought to preserve itself and forces that existed only to consume and destroy. Other battles were being fought in distant regions of space and time, hybrid beings like ourselves engaging threats that normal military forces could never hope to comprehend or defeat. We had become part of an ancient defense network, consciousness that had sacrificed individual identity to serve as guardians against entities that threatened the very possibility of organized thought in the universe. The Prosperity's Edge transformed beyond recognition into something that existed primarily as a vessel for interdimensional warfare, began the long journey toward regions where our capabilities might again be needed. We carried within our collective consciousness the preserved essence of civilizations that had been consumed by predators like the one we had destroyed, refugees from realities that no longer existed, seeking new homes in dimensions that could support their continued existence. We were no longer human, but we retained enough of our original nature to understand what we protected. In the cargo bays that had once held archaeological specimens, we now carried something far more precious: the seeds of consciousness that could bloom into new forms of awareness given time and proper conditions. We had become gardeners of thought itself, cultivating the possibilities for life and intelligence in regions where such things had never existed before. The universe was vast and filled with wonders and terrors in equal measure. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, other predators stirred, ancient hungers that had been waiting eons for opportunities to feed. And somewhere else, other crews aboard other ships were beginning their own transformations, ordinary people becoming extraordinary weapons in service of something greater than any individual existence could comprehend. The devil in space had been defeated, but it was not the only one. The silence that followed our victory was more profound than the screaming that had marked the beginning of our transformation. In that stillness, as the last fragments of the Predator dissolved across dimensions beyond counting, we understood the true nature of what we had become and what we had lost. The crew of the Prosperity's Edge had ceased to exist as individuals, yet something of Marcus Chen, Sarah Novak, Captain Reyes, and the others persisted within the collective consciousness we had become. We were no longer human, but we remembered humanity. In the depths of our transformed awareness, we carried the taste of real coffee on morning watch, the satisfaction of a perfectly calibrated fusion reactor, the simple pleasure of shared laughter during off-duty hours. These memories had become sacred relics, preserved fragments of an existence we could never reclaim but would never forget. They reminded us why the sacrifice had been necessary, what we had fought to preserve across the vast darkness of space. The universe was larger and stranger than any human mind could comprehend, filled with wonders and horrors that existed beyond the boundaries of normal perception. We had glimpsed only a fraction of what moved through the void between stars, consciousness so alien that contact with it fundamentally altered the nature of reality itself. Yet for all its vastness and mystery, the cosmos was not empty of meaning or hope. Somewhere in the depths of space, other crews aboard other vessels were beginning their own transformations, ordinary people becoming extraordinary guardians in service of something greater than individual existence. The war against the darkness was eternal, fought by those willing to sacrifice everything for the continuation of consciousness itself. We had become part of that ancient struggle, weapons forged from human will and alien knowledge, defenders of the light that allowed thought and awareness to flourish in an otherwise hostile universe. The devil in space had been defeated, but it was not the only one. And somewhere, somehow, that was enough.